Why 90s kids are wired differently. If you grew up in the 1990s, you remember a world that no longer exists. A world without smartphones, without social media, without constant surveillance, notifications, or digital pressure. Today, we're breaking down the traits and characteristics of people who grew up in the 1990s and why they think, love, connect, and cope differently than other generations. 90s kids are the bridge generation. They grew up calling friends on landlines, memorizing phone numbers, waiting days or weeks for photos to be developed, watching TV on a fixed schedule. There was no rewind button on life, only patience. Then suddenly, dial-up internet arrived. Texting replaced calling. Social media replaced privacy. Psychologically, this created adaptability without dependence. 90s kids learned technology, but didn't grow up emotionally dependent on it. They can unplug without panic, and that alone sets them apart. Many people who grew up in the 90s were raised with freedom and responsibility early. You were expected to walk to school, solve boredom on your own, handle conflicts face-to-face, figure things out without instructions. There was no instant help, no tutorials, no online validation. This shaped a strong sense of internal problem-solving. 90s kids tend to ask, "What can I do about this?" before asking the world for answers. Friendships in the 90s were built slowly. You didn't text all day. You didn't see each other's lives in real time. You met after school, at malls, at arcades, at each other's homes, which meant presence mattered. Psychologically, this taught emotional depth over emotional availability. That's why many 90s kids value meaningful conversations, feel drained by constant messaging, miss connection that isn't performative. They don't need constant access to feel bonded. Growing up in the 90s meant being bored, a lot, and boredom wasn't treated as a problem to fix. There was no endless scroll, no dopamine on demand, so the mind adapted. This created creativity, imagination, emotional regulation, tolerance for stillness. That's why many 90s kids can sit in silence without reaching for distraction, and why today's overstimulation feels exhausting to them. Emotional expression in the 90s was different. Feelings were often downplayed, minimized, or handled privately. You learned to cope quietly. As adults, this shows up as high emotional resilience, difficulty asking for help, deep empathy for others, struggles with vulnerability. They feel deeply, but don't always show it publicly. 90s humor was sarcastic, observational, subtle, sometimes dark. It wasn't about attention, it was about recognition. That's why many 90s kids use humor to process pain, avoid oversharing emotions, prefer wit over volume. Their humor says, if you get it, you get it. People who grew up in the 90s witnessed media fear cycles, economic instability, shifting cultural narratives. They learned early, not everything is as advertised. This created healthy skepticism. They question trends. They don't trust hype easily. They value substance over appearance, which is why many 90s kids feel disconnected from influencer culture. Unlike digital native generations, 90s kids didn't grow up branding themselves. Their identity was formed privately, slowly, offline. So many of them now value privacy over popularity, peace over performance, meaning over metrics. They don't need to be seen constantly. They just want to be understood. People who grew up in the 1990s are adaptable but grounded, independent but empathetic, nostalgic but realistic, quietly resilient. They carry two worlds inside them, the one that disappeared and the one that replaced it, and that tension shaped who they are. If you grew up in the 90s, what's one thing from that time you miss the most? Let us know in the comments and watch our next video.